What was the hardest piece of news you've had to tell someone? I worked as a pediatric psychology fellow while in graduate school PhD clinical psychology. This invoked providing psychological services for all children in the hospital. One of my very first weeks I was shadowing a more experienced fellow and we encountered a family whose child, 7-year-old, was hospitalized after she was in a car accident with her father. Her father died in the accident and no one in her family was comfortable directly explaining this to the child. They had used a lot of religious euphemisms about death. He's watching over you in heaven. He's with you in spirit. But this language is not concrete enough for a young child who doesn't really understand death. Sitting with this child, body brace, lacerations all over, very flat affect, and explaining to her what death was, that her father had died, and having to ask questions to make sure she understood was one of the most traumatizing experiences of my graduate training. I can still vividly imagine her face while we were telling her and the tears silently rolling down her face. Thank you for your compassion. I am sure that was horrifically challenging, but the fact that you remember her shows how much it affected you, and I'm sure she affected your personal and professional development. You are good people for taking on that pain to help her and her family. Had to call my girlfriend parents at 1 AM to tell them there was a bad accident, that their daughter was en route to her and I thought she would be okay. She died on arrival. Worst day of my life. Frick dude. I can't imagine the pain you must have gone through. I hope you are kind to yourself. When I was 22 my parents asked me to come home and watch my grandma, who had dementia and needed a caregiver, while they went to visit my brother who was living out of the country. 2 days in, my grandma died in her sleep. Not only did I have to deal with being the person who found my grandma dead by myself, but I then had to call all of my various family members, parents, aunts, brothers, to let them know what happened. Sorry it came down to you to bear the bad news. I hope you enjoyed each other's company in her final days. I had to call my friend's girlfriend to let her know he'd been killed in an accident, and then share that news with his best friend on a pursuant call. That's the worst one I have seen yet. Definitely telling my grandmother that her daughter, my mother, had just died. Nothing quite prepares you for telling someone about a death, especially when it's their child. I'm sorry for both your losses. I had to tell my mom that my dad died. 40 years later I had to tell my kids I had cancer. I'm sorry, I should have said I beat it. At least for now. Wow, thank you for silver. So sweet. Well, I hope you survive. I don't know what kind of cancer you have, but a lot of them don't have a high fatality rate. I've told the story before, but I was a NYC paramedic and had to walk a guy through his own death one night. He was crushed and folded by a subway car. As soon as we moved the subway car we knew he would bleed out. He had no family to call. I suspect it had something to do with his sexuality, and I'm a huge believer that no one dies alone. I had FDNY and the MTA set up a spot so I could crawl under the car next to him and we could talk as the process happened. I gave him plenty of morphine and he took my hand as the lift was started. I didn't let go till I pronounced him. P.S. Tommy, I stayed till we had to close the doors, man. I promised I would. My wife lights that candle for you every anniversary too. No one will ever forget you as long as I have a say. Excuse me while I ugly cry. I had to tell my wife that our 8-year-old son had died in the night. He was on hospice and it was expected, but that was still hard. Then I had to phone my older children and tell them. Thursday will mark 2 years. Professionally, I had to tell the parents of a 20-year-old basketball star that his drug use did not account for his unusual thoughts and behaviors, that he was, in fact, psychotic and likely schizophrenic. I can't even fathom such a thing. I choke up when the invasive thoughts come in of what kinds of awful things could happen to my own son, and it terrifies me. I commend any parent that still finds a way to keep going after losing a child. I hope you've been able to see some brighter days after all that darkness. My brother, who was active military at the time, had to be granted emergency leave for my mother who was on her deathbed after a short but destructive battle with cancer. They took more than 24 hours to sign one name on that document to release him, even knowing the circumstances. When he became noticeably upset that they were taking their time with it, they pulled him aside and threatened to make him undergo a psych evaluation for being Understandably angry, she died while he was on his flight home. I had to tell him over the phone that he missed the passing of our mom and he wouldn't ever be able to say goodbye. That was rough. Oh wow, frick them so hard for dragging their feet. When my grandmother passed, we knew it was coming as she had been ill for a very long time. I was at home with my mom when my aunt called with the news that she was gone. My younger sister was at school, so we went to pick her up. When she was called to the office and she saw us there, I think a part of her knew why we came to pick her up, but that didn't make it easier to tell her. One Sunday at church, I was walking my baby outside when one of my best friend's mom came up to me. She was in hunting attire and looked to be in complete shock. She told me her husband, my friend's dad, had just fallen out of his tree stand and broken his neck and died, and she asked me to go get her daughter out of church to let her know. It was one of the worst days in my life. Whoa. After my wife woke up from a medically induced coma, I had to tell her our son died. The look of soul-shattering pain still bothers me. I just can't. That must have been the lowest moment imaginable. I hope you find some joy and happiness now and in the future. When I told my dad that he was in the early stage of dying and was moving to hospice care, he told me, oh good, because he was so tired of being sick with Parkinson's. He died 2 weeks later. My dad was a cop for 27 years, so I asked him. Dad was working the midnight shift. They got a call about a car accident, arrived on the scene to find a fatality. Turns out the guy who was killed was a police officer's son. He was also a close family friend. My dad had to go to one of his best friend and co-worker's house at like 2 AM to tell him his son had been struck and killed by a drunk driver. That's heartbreaking. I had to tell my girlfriend that her grandmother had passed away. Her mom called me and asked me to break the news to her, since she's terrible at that stuff. We had only been together about a year and I had to leave work to drive over and tell her. She had just come back from visiting her grandmother a few provinces away a few days earlier and the doctors said she would be okay. She was so close with her grandmother, I knew it would be devastating to her. It was. She cried for a few hours. I booked her on the next flight home and helped her pack. To this day, something I'll never forget doing. On the plus side, we are still together almost 7 years later and have a beautiful baby girl. I like to think that the moment brought us closer together. It might have been hard at the time, but it was right, and you're very honorable for sticking it out with her. I headed up a few departments at my last job, and as dept head, I had to be the one to fire people in those departments. It always sucks, even if they are the worst and totally deserve it. Never feels good to take away someone's security. I worked at a company that would make you jump through hoops to fire anyone. So if after a couple of months of me trying to work with somebody to get them on the right path didn't help, they would get fired. The job wasn't especially hard, so I always felt better with the thought that if the job was really important to them, they might have pushed a little harder to keep it. Trying to explain to my 4-year-old niece why my longtime girlfriend wasn't with me anymore. She just didn't understand and kept asking questions like, I thought Auntie loved you? Why did she leave? The breakup was recent in that conversation. That conversation hurt, man. After my parents split up, my dad moved us in with his mother. She was one of those grandmas who woke up every morning to get my siblings and I up for school because my dad left for work at 4 AM and worked 12-hour days usually. One day she didn't wake us up. Just as I was coming out of my room, I saw my younger, 4 years, I was 17, coming out of her room. We just kind of looked at each other and had an oh crap moment. I went in to check on grandma. She was cold, so I called 911 and then had to call dad. That was hard, and because he worked about 30 minutes away, this was the 90s so cell phones weren't that common yet. I had to call all the aunts and uncles too, and then dig out grandma's DNA from where dad told me it was and hand it to the EMTs that showed up. So it was definitely the 7 worst calls of my life so far. I'm glad he could tell you where the DNA was. I need to get copies of my parents-in-law's just in case. A friend of mine at university committed suicide. I ended up sitting down with or calling some of our friends, so the first they heard of it wasn't over Facebook or in the news. 18 months on and it still eats away a bit inside. 18 months. 18 years here. It doesn't go away. It gets much easier, but it's always there somewhere. It helps to focus on the good memories and to try to take something positive from the experience, as difficult as it may sound. Bar regular of mine almost fell to his death washing windows in a 4-story building. He miraculously survived yet broke every bone in his body and cracked his skull. First responders were firefighters right near Houston St. and Broadway in NYC. If they hadn't responded he would have died right there. Fast forward 4 weeks later, the 15th of September, 2001. He is out of his coma and finally able to be taken home by his sister and out of hospice. Barely able to speak, he manages to whisper that he wants her pass him by the fire station 2 blocks down so he could thank his rescuers. His sister had to then explain the black smoke still lingering in the air, the entirety of the 9/11 attacks, and that every single first responder that helped him perished. Sometimes that worn out older man sitting at the bar day drinking red wine has a really good story to tell. Broke my heart. This is one of those stories where you don't have anything to add and just kinda sit like dang. I had to tell my best friend in high school that I was the one who reported her dad for molesting her. She had spoken only to me in confidence and our pastor. They pulled her out of class after it was reported and allowed her a friend for comfort. She chose me and she sat sobbing, speaking of how horribly she hated our pastor, how she would never forgive him. I looked her in the eyes and told her it was me. I was 16. Tell my dad, who was in the hospital 2 weeks away from his own death, that his father had died. Dad hadn't yet accepted that he himself was dying, though my sister and I could see it. Grandpa had been in hospice for 2 months, so we all knew that his end was near. In the week between Grandpa's death and his funeral, Dad began to accept that he didn't have much time left. Dad made it to Grandpa's funeral, albeit via ambulance wheelchair, and saw his extended family for the last time. That was a surreal experience for me, watching him say goodbye. That must have been heartbreaking for you. Mom and her 4-year-old daughter were in a house fire. Mom had 3rd-degree burns over 60% of her body. She was put in a medically induced coma. After extubating the mom a few days later, my roommate, a surgery resident, had to tell her that her daughter was brain dead. My daughter died from suicide at 20 years old. My mom was in her last hours in hospice. I had to tell her it was the worst weekend in my life. 10 years later, I still struggle with it. I miss them both every day. She told me she would look for her. That is by far the sweetest thing. I'm so sad for you. I had to tell my best friend one of his fraternity brothers committed suicide. He was out of school for the semester and I knew informing him wouldn't be the top priority by anyone in the house. So I called him. It was the most heartbreaking thing to have to do, especially over the phone. I wished I could have been there for him in person. I think it was the only time I'd seen him cry. Telling my mom over the phone while she's in the hospital that I just found my dad in bed, passed away. She was in so much denial that he had died. She tried to convince me that maybe he's just doped up on sleeping pills. I wished it were true, but I had already knew he was gone when I tried to move him. Stiff as a board. Paramedics came in and confirmed he died. Mum was on the phone still and heard everything. I never knew heartbreak could have a sound until I heard my mom break down on the phone. I tried to keep my composure, but I ended up having to mute the phone call and let some tears out myself. This was almost 2 years ago. That sound is something that you hear and feel at the same time. It's something that you never want to experience again. When I was 13, I'd come home from school and was the first one home. I spotted a trail of blood leading up the pavement. Thought nothing of it until I realized it led into my garden and around the back of the house. Ran inside and found the trail leading upstairs to my sister's bedroom, where I found our dog, a 4-year-old black Labrador, dead, covered in blood and clearly had been in a lot of pain. My neighbor came running behind me and explained that Max had gotten out of the back somehow and took himself for a walk where he got hit by a car. He managed to drag himself home and curled up on my sister's bed. The driver had followed him and tried knocking on our door, but no one was home, so explained what had happened to a neighbor. Me and my neighbor cleaned the blood from around our house and garden. Had to call my mum and dad to tell them, and they came home as quick as they could. But my sister, 8 years old at the time, came home before then, and I had to explain why she couldn't go in her room. She ended up sleeping in my room for a week. Telling my parents that my college girlfriend was pregnant during senior year. It was a rough conversation, but I had built it up in my head that it was going to be far worse. The follow-up conversation about it all having been faked by her was also very hard. Had to tell my parents that my brother took his own life. I still cringe when the phone rings. This was quite some time ago. One of my co-workers introduced me to my now wife. They were best friends. My co-worker was on her way to work on evening and someone crossed the double yellow and hit her head on, killing her. I received a call from manager informing me of the incident. I had to call my now wife and tell her that her best friend had been killed in a car wreck. This was probably the worst memory of my life. I had to tell my son, not biological, no legal rights to him, that I wanted to divorce his dad. I barely see him now, and he doesn't even consider me his parent anymore. I don't really know how to deal with it. I don't even think I'm supposed to still call him my son. But how do you become a not parent to someone you've parented, largely by yourself, for 8 years? Reach out. You can check with your ex first to make sure it's not weird. But as the adult, it's your responsibility to maintain the relationship. You can even just send postcards. I had to tell a few friends that our friend, my best friend growing up, killed himself at age 25. Then I and one friend I broke the news to told a roommate, a girl our departed friend actually dated briefly, and we just didn't have the words, so we started laughing nervously. She thought we were about to tell her a joke and she started laughing too. God, it was awful. It was like our brains couldn't process the task at hand and short-circuited. Total guru meditation. It took a few hours for it all to sink in and then I cried for days. We all did. When I was told a friend had died by suicide the night before, my reaction was gut-busting laughter. It made everyone angry, but I couldn't help it. It's just where my brain chose to go with that unspeakably awful information. So odd how our minds try to cushion our fall. Had to call one of my best friends to tell him our other friend was to be taken off life support, and he had to come say goodbye. That was 3 years ago. Still painful, but time heals. While my best friend was away at boot camp, his longtime girlfriend was cheating on him and was being open about it. Had to tell him the night he got home because he was wanting to propose to her. He didn't believe me until I told him how she was sneaking guys into her parents' house, and he said that's how I always snuck in. Oh god, that is so f'd up. My dad found me right after I drank bleach, was 14, attempted suicide. Had to explain why my room smelled like bleach to a man slowly losing it as he pieced together what was happening while in excruciating pain. Telling my husband that his mum had died, telling my brother-in-law that his mum had died, and telling my kids that their grandma had died. Same amazing lady, but 3 different conversations. Awful day. My lifelong best friend died suddenly at 35. It was just a few days before he was supposed to get married to a girl he'd been with for 10 years and who he had wanted to marry for years, but they couldn't quite pull it off. He survived a near-death experience a few years earlier, and he made it out to all of us that things were okay, so none of us suspected he was in any danger. A surgery could have prevented the heart failure he suffered, but he could not afford this, being out of work at the time and without insurance. I was the first to know among our friends. It fell to me to tell them. He was the best of us. In an eerie mirror of how we met each friend since childhood, I had to progress through the list, calling each, telling them of this unspeakable tragedy. I relived the years as we met everyone. Every good memory now agonizing. This friend was a homebody, and so we took for granted that he was okay, and never really forced him to come hang out with everybody like we should have. So ultimately we got a few extra years with him that we didn't utilize well, because he did such a good job making us all believe everything was okay that we thought it was all behind him. It's been a few years since he's gone now, but I still miss him every day. All I could say to any of them was he's gone. People afterward said I'm sorry for your loss, and I always corrected them. Losing him was everyone's loss. A surgery could have prevented the heart failure he suffered, but he could not afford this, being out of work at the time and without insurance. Frick. Without meaning to make this political, it makes me so angry that that is still a problem in the richest country in the world. So sorry you lost your friend. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.